Hello everyone, today I would like to talk about ophlology and especially the weighing of the Western Knights equipment during the very end of the 13th century. And in conclusion, I will also discuss this figure that you find in background, which is a quite good prototype of the quite a good example, let's say, of this progressive weighing of the of the armor, and generally speaking, this is a very important time in history for the evolution of armors in Western Europe. It wasn't really anything revolutionary. Please always be distrustful towards those people who talk about, they use the word revolution in military affairs because it's just quite distasteful historiographical fashion to make certain theories echo more than others. Um, but especially in military affairs, revolutions are indeed extremely rare, and I believe that the whole concept behind it is wrong. If anything, because it even changed the etymology of the term in order to force the concept of. But it's still a moment of transition, as all history is in some measure. But this is kind of important simply because this is the moment in in medieval armor into which plate armor starts to spread widely. We have examples of plate armor already being used at this point from the mid of the 13th century, especially from in the German armies. That is interesting for many reasons, and there is a lot of debate on why this change occurred in Germany at that time. Maybe we will talk about it in another occasion. Today I would like to concentrate instead on one of the consequences that this brought, that is the increasement of weight, quite obviously from the adoption of plate armor over literally the knight's body. So and it's a kind of a double, there are various stereotypes attached to this problem of weight, because the old Vulgata was something that that said that since towards the end of the 13th century the armor was increasing in weight, um, this weight would be kind of extremely difficult to bear. It would hamper movements, it would be very difficult to move, etc. So even weights like 20 kilos or 25 kilos were seen as, by some authors, especially in the past, as something so difficult to sustain. But telling the truth, we know that this is not true at all, in the sense that the armor was increasing in weight, but the movements of the knights, although rendered more difficult, obviously, for physical reasons, were still extremely easily bearable, especially by those fit, strong young men that, being at the peak of their physical strength and fitness, could, easily wear this weight. Armor is conceived to be anatomic at best, and when we talk about 13th century knights, we're thinking mostly about a very the very elite of society, so people who could afford, in some measure, some of the best technologies of the time, and the anatomic nature of the armor was conceived in order to distribute quite ergonomically the weight over the knight's body. And this is something that even if you have never actually worn an armor, like me, by the way, you can grasp from the same nature of the armor for what it is. At this time, the basic armor had been, up to that point at least, the mail armor. That is something extremely ancient, used since millennia before Christ, and that had been and would remain the pretty much the standard armor in the West and in the East for even up to the 17th century and even beyond. Telling the truth, there were certain communities scattered all over Asia that kept using the mail armor even up to the 20th century, so it's nothing really surprising. And mail armor, as you can see, maybe not here, but if you have a mental picture um, of of a knight of these times, was something it's something very well distributed. It goes perfectly well all over the body, and the general all the mass that made up the armor was very well put over the body, and this didn't really create a big problem. The Roman mail was something a bit more than 8 kilos. And in the Middle Ages it started increasing up to the 9 and 14 kilos, and we're talking just about mail. Then you have to think about other things, of course, at this point. So the full plate armor was something around 20-25 kilos at worst, let's say. This time there is nothing like that, so we can imagine 15 kilos. And the plate armor that was being added was usually in small parts, even though this is the moment at the end of the 13th century in which you actually see a whole bust, like in this picture, even though it's concealed by the mantle, basically covered in plate armor. So it was much of an extra weight. You could have greaves, like in the picture, other protections. Then you obviously had the helm. Here we have what we can classify as a great helm, and which was a couple of other kilos, and or even more, but generally speaking, wasn't this great weight. Yet, progressively, you have to consider many other factors. The weight of the shield, of the lengths, of the swords that you carried attached on your hang on your belt. You could even have 2 swords. We know sometimes knights had one attached to the saddle and another on the belt, and plus the gambizon behind that is not very heavy, but that maybe makes you lose a bit of sensibility, because it's supposed to be this flexible, soft cloth to be worn under mail, and you could have gauntlets. That also maybe doesn't make you extremely comfortable, because even when you unless it's not something extremely adherent, even if you wear a glove, you don't have the same sense of touch that you have obviously with your barely naked hand. But these are kind of virtually influent thing as singular factors, but altogether definitely your movements are not the same as if you wore something lighter, which seems natural, but it is not, especially when you're doing a great effort like fighting, like it was the case for a professional war, like a knight. So first of all, even horse riding is something extremely physical, demanding. It's not that you sit on saddle and yeah, that's it. You have to balance yourself. You have to point your feet on the stirrups. You have to work pretty much with your legs, but also with your bust and with your arms. Fighting, and during fight you probably have adrenaline pumping, and being extremely consuming a whole deal of energies. And if you're doing that with 25 kilos on your body, that's not gonna be so comfortable, let me tell you. And that's adding pretty much to the exhaustion. That is something that arrives quite easily. There is probably the most important aspect in combat after moral resources and feelings, etc. It's fatigue. I mean, we know, as a matter of fact, that fights couldn't last literally more than 5 minutes if you didn't want to go in exhaustion. In fact, most of the fights in history, if not every fight in history, was fought with this, 5 minutes, really giving all the best you got, and then withdrawing and reforming, lining up once again, and to attack after, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour, because this is how really warfare was about. There were no melee combat like you find in Hollywood movies. Melee was something. There was no individual fighting. It was always a collective effort, and there were formation dynamics that really influenced the fight. So that even people who think about the singular technical skill that you can find in treatises and so on, that's mostly for duels, meant for duels. And while warfare was a kind of much more messy and unprecise and unrefined thing, even for professionals like these. And what therefore added up to tactics, because this is really what the whole complex gets down to. If you saw these knights, they could perfectly move in their armor. Simply they got more exhausted. Um, I mean, they got exhausted more quickly. So one of the, if you took the knight individually, maybe he was a guy who could like run, jump on saddle, or doing any other kind of acrobatics in armor. We know, as a matter of fact, in 15th century, were guys in full plate armor doing like all kind of jumps um, and somersaults and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, that's something you can kind of do in a circus. I mean, if you are in an individual, if you are alone, let's suppose, and you have to fight against an opponent, maybe those those qualities, those abilities can turn out to be useful. But that's not war. That's an individual fight, and you can be the best guy in the world, but you fight alone, you're probably gonna be taken down by sheer numbers in a very easy time. There were no superheroes in history, just saying. And what really mattered in truly military affairs was collective training and the collective performance, as a matter of fact. So what did really plate armor bring to warfare in general that changed a little bit things? Well, first of all, this weight collectively was felt in the formation, in the sense that, first of all, the more you increased weight in armor, the more robust horse breeds you needed to mount these knights on. So normally we see that in the Middle Ages there were kind of various kind of breeds that even a same knight could use, because normally a knight had a usually a stallion, a war horse that was meant to be the one for doing very heavy charges, and that was incidentally slower. and that for that reason the knight usually have a lighter horse that even in cases of trouble he could mount and and flee literally from the battlefield, something that at that time was obviously stigmatized as like the worst shame in chivalric military ethics, and not just in that period in history, but so it was, because the reality of war is always crude, it's always unpicturesque and unglorious in many ways. And this meant that during this time, horse breeds and say the cavalry that was used into battle was getting heavier. Now, at the level of formation, that meant that first of all, it was more difficult to maintain order. Because if you have a heavy horse that only can go at that pace, and maybe it slows down for some reason, it's more difficult to make it catch up with the rest of the horses than if you are less lightly armored and you are on a faster horse. So paradoxically, um, heavier horses are more difficult to keep information. At least this is what I believe. I might be wrong, but you know, if you have a horse that doesn't stress itself too much, it can go back and forth easily. It's easier, you know, to stay information because it's simply more. Um, it's less cumbersome. You can make it speed wherever you like. You can have a better. But the point is that cavalry charges need a certain body mass also to, mostly as a deterrent, to be effective. You have to think that normally the actual impact on very thickly compact infantry formations or units or even other cavalry formations was something relatively rare. You know, the heavy knights, you know, the mounted elite was normally sent into battle when the enemy formation was already tired and you know, adequately softened up, and therefore the only sight of these guys charging would make them break before they even impacted. So um, you get it actually quite clear from military history that knights spent literally hours and hours on the battlefield to spot the right point to charge in, and only when it was already disordered and they could practically pass through or at least get over some guys, but not having really a stone wall against them, because it's physically impossible. Also because the horse normally doesn't charge in something like a wall of spears, and so this is really basics of cavalry, and as a consequence, coming back to the weighting of the armor, the cavalry formations would become more kind of more cumbersome. You know, they for themselves. I mean, they were more difficult to maneuver. They usually entered into action with you know, on a good terrain with a specific target. Because if you want to make a cavalry charge, you need order. So even if you have the very best of cavalry, you can't really make a charge and then continue charging through the battlefield as if nothing was, like in video games. You need to reform, to line up, and to recharge. And the heavier the cavalry became, the more laborious, at least these measures would be carried out. And this doesn't mean that these guys wouldn't do that. I mean, we know from sources that cavalries were able to line up over and over again, because these were really people living just doing that, training constantly in tournaments, in collective training, and they knew perfectly how to do it. But let's say that throughout, first of all, not always the chances to do that on a battlefield, also in terms of timing and how the whole battle goes. Secondly, there is really no um, um, a very great difficulty to keep everyone in order, because these are not even robots that kind of, yeah, they say that they get orders and they get into formation. These are guys were scared, were injured, who were confused, we can lose orientation, we can get insane. The attrition in war is something you can't really halt in any ways. So, as a consequence of the weakening of the especially the cavalry armor, there was a consequent kind of mm, I can't find the right term, but it's as if they were channeled just in a certain kind of operation. I'm not saying that knights didn't fight in any other way, because actually during the 14th century, but in general in medieval history, most of the warfare knights went in wasn't, as a matter of fact, on horseback. Especially in this time, at the beginning of 14th century, knights become constantly more involved in battlefields that are much more heavily trenched or fortified in any other way. Castles starts to spread very much, and consequently firearms. Um, so the knight in part readapts to fight as he had always done, but kind of coming back probably from the 13th century was the peak of cavalry to to the kind of dirty jobs, because the 13th century had been like the apotheosis of cavalry. There are very few battles in this time in Western Europe that were fought between cavalry and infantry. Normally, were just armies of cavalrymen, and the ones who won, one after the other, simply ran over all the other insurgents and baggage trains, etc. So it was over. From the 13th century, from the 14th century onwards, instead you have even infantrymen that kind of get quite nasty for cavalry. There were the great victories of infantry over cavalry, especially in the first half of the century. So the knight kind of gets even um, um, he's not this sacred figure anymore, even from in terms of its a tactical role, and he has to adapt it for something else. But in the strictly cavalry warfare, it's not surprising that from the 14th century, so from the moment in which the development of plate armor kind of flares up and becomes unstoppable, and it's in constant acceleration, cavalry, not surprisingly, starts to get kind of specialized into various things, because the heavy guys are normally always heavier, and therefore always more elite, and always less able to do everything on the battlefield. Close to them, they're not just the squires, but really separated and detached units, like the telling the truth existed already in the previous centuries, but at this point get kind of more standard in armies, especially to carry out certain scouting operations, getting involved even against infantry. We're talking about mounted crossbowmen or bowmen, and other kind of troops like that. And this tells you that in this sense the cavalry that did everything, like could be Norman times when the Norman guys kind of went back and forth on horseback and on foot, and there was really no one who could oppose them, like in terms of infantry, if not peasants that could be slaughtered quite easily. Especially I'm talking about the feudal war, because you say, well, but at Hastings there were Oscars that were kind of a very good infantry. Yes, and were also other infantries at the time, but generally speaking, um, especially in the feudalized societies, these guys were kind of the only military elite, because or the military presence at all, because the feudal society also brought to the disarmament of the local peasant communities. This is why, for instance, we believe that at a certain point um, during the Middle Ages, weapons like slings that were the typical poor's arm weapon kind of disappeared because the peasants' masses were kind of put under couldn't really do much more against their lords, and they would get quite easily disarmed and sent to work in the camps, and that's pretty much it. And at that time, the cavalrymen could do really everything. Could fight on foot. Usually, in Norman times, the heavy infantry was essentially the most of the times the same guy, Norman cavalrymen dismounted, for instance, and so on. So, as you understand, it's a lot of change. So, why it happened, first of all, that the armor got heavier towards the end of the 13th century, and why um, and why was plate armor invented? In detail, it's difficult to explain why it happened, but if you get the broader picture, it's relatively easy. Um, Historians are quite in agreement in stressing the importance of crossbow and in this period, and it's very fast and spread all over Europe, and especially its increasement in power. First crossbows weren't that powerful. In the 14th century, you could have really kind of one-man crossbows that could really have a huge power, huge impact. So the first consequence in armor is just let's make armor thicker, and the mail is not enough anymore because normally mail could stop certain kind of bullets, especially bow arrows, but with crossbow it starts to get something a bit worse, but it's very progressive, telling the truth. And let's say that before the 16th century, you can argue, technologically speaking, that every armor that was created was practically effective to counter the bullets, the projectiles that were thrown at them, whether it was firearms or or bows. They kind of immediately caught up with the progress, but it was still necessary to have this strengthening of armor. And plate armor, at that point, is the answer because it's thicker. It can arrest much more easily bullets, even with a few millimeters that at that time were actually very very expensive to obtain because materially speaking, it was a rising society, but it was still quite poor in many ways. And this is how progressively these plate armor kicks in, and as we will be seeing now, it's not that full plate was worn. That's a process that took around more than a century to be achieved. It started with plaques put here and there in a very artisanal, in a very kind of artisan manner, very devoid of any form of standardization. It was everything based on the wearer's desires and possibilities, and it kind of increased in strength. Another element that I think can maybe explain partly a certain developments, especially in the leg armor, which you don't find very very often said in in historiography, but at least I think it's evident, is that around this time infantries were kind of developing quite fast. So if you're on horseback and you have an infantryman coming at you with spears and stuff, probably the most exposed part of your body is legs. So here we have a perfect example of that with a in the picture with a metal greave and a plane on there is this uh, knee covering that starts getting metal. mm, but we will talking about that later more in detail. And I wanted just to say here that coming back on the tactical point that um, heavy cavalry especially starts getting at this point much more demanding, also in energetic terms, because horses need to be tougher to sustain the weight of the horsemen. The knight, in fact, has to be better trained, more physically resistant, better fed. He needs even more training because obviously it's more difficult to keep with that armor on for a longer time. Um, it implies that the baggage train of this knight has to be greater, or at least that it has to be served by better in some ways. This is telling the truth the moment into which the esquires that had been up to that point kind of light cavalry attached to the one of their armored masters kind of get well equipped as much sometimes even as their masters. It was even difficult to distinguish them, and it's a kind of a figure that disappears as such. I mean, there were obviously certain attendants that would help the knight, and some of them would be even soldiers, specialized infantrymen in his retinue. But this can be explained also through the fact that warfare was getting um, um, uh, much more financed than it had been in the past from a strictly monetary point of view, which meant that since European society was wealthier, these guys could be paid and basically buy whatever they liked on the way. If you think about the English Indian tours or the Italian condotte, this is basically how it was. I pay you and then you provide for yourself as a mercenary. I don't have to give you a fief for maintaining yourself. And this is part also process triggered by the rise of national monarchies, or at least in general, more centralized political entities that could essentially pay for more troops and didn't have to rely on this feudal system of that guy present there that had to be called up and had to bring all the baggage train requested by the king, etc. It was much quicker. The market of war was much more crowded. Was much more crowded than ever, essentially. So it was easier to rely on these professionals that came literally from nowhere sometimes, and that even managed to rise to very high positions um, to um, thanks to their military service. And therefore you understand how many factors are into play, but the main consequence is that cavalry basically, and especially after the 14 the Black Death, the wipes out great part of the middle classes of Europe, especially during the 14th and 15th century. That is the moment in which they covered themselves in plate armor, kind of kickback probably compared to the 14th, at least the first half of the 14th century, and society kind of gets refeudalized in some measure because you couldn't still get rid of the feudal system as such, and these guys maybe you could pay them to wage war, but then they wanted something more as a reward in the end. But here we're getting really a bit beyond our practical interests in here. Um, so moral of the story: heavier equipment that, however, didn't really necessarily hamper the movements. We have, as a matter of fact, coming back on the weight point, throughout all history, there were certain guys that served with much more weight than a medieval knight, like a Roman legionnaire at the peak of his um, effort could even carry something up to 40 kilos, and obviously that hasn't to be stressed too much because sometimes it was carried by other by chariots, and during the fight obviously he wouldn't carry the whole thing around. But even if you take the average Napoleonic soldier, or even if you consider the equipment of uh, a First World War infantryman, these guys could bring very heavy loads of gear that were much superior to the weight of medieval armor. Uh, the only difference being that the medieval armor was worn and by soldiers who had to fight in an extremely physical manner. If you were a Napoleonic infantryman, you could be psychologically, psychophysically stressed by a lot of other reasons, but basically what you did into battle was hold a musket, shooting it and reloading it. So you weren't really you might have all your backpack that weighed a lot, but you didn't have to kind of to do what a medieval knight had to do. It was kicking and breaking other people's arms and legs, or getting very physical into things. So it was a substantially a distance fighting most of the times, bayonet charges being something extremely rare. So the moral of the story is that for a trained knight, it wasn't nothing excessive to fight with this armor, although it kind of had a toll, and we have historical accounts that from one side tell us that knights could jump with this armor on and do everything they wanted. On the other hand, there were other knights who had troubles, especially, I don't know, maybe they were thrown off some horses and think of the trauma and the fear, maybe some broken bone. They, when they were on the terrain, that maybe their armor couldn't make them move properly, and they couldn't even stand up back on foot. So it's really something that you have to put into relation to many factors. For instance, the fact that we're very old men fighting as knights. I studied. I remember for my master thesis the case of one guy exactly at the end of the 13th century in a German battle that basically kept fighting both in tournaments and into war at more than 80 years old. So it's obvious that he could be an extremely skilled man, but probably he didn't have the same strengths of when he was 21. So you have to count these variables, and you have to count everything that could happen that maybe was not related to the fatigue of the armor, but to which the fatigue of the armor added and could knock the warrior out in many ways. Another great problem of this armor weighing was the progressive enclosure of your face. Up to it's basically in the 30s of the 13th century that the helm of the Western Knight was perfectly closed all around. You just had certain holes for breathing and certain eye slits that were very heavily reinforced, by the way, because they were extremely vulnerable points. There were more than one people that got his head pierced through by a lance that had entered through the eye slit. Also because that's what the enemy knight would aim with his lance at you. at that point. And so I think this tells it all. And finally, I would like to comment on this figure here. This is the seal of the Guild of St. George from Ferrara, that is a city in northern Italy. It's dated back to roughly 1290. So and it's very interesting because it's kind of ahead for its times, in the sense that here I think there is the first known evidence of full plate greaves as they're shown here. And at least this is, I think, a good impression, and that tells you regarding what I was talking about before, the development of infantry at this stage. The Italians had very pretty strong infantries at this time, and I think it's not surprise, maybe not a coincidence, although other factors are implied, that these guys wearing full plate armor for the first witness time in Europe, exactly into northern Italy. And that can explain it, maybe in part. And it's interesting because, as we were saying before, plate armor was um, mostly spread in, first of all, in the German armies, at least firstly spread in German armies, but here you find that the Italians had this kind of equipment before, at least for the scanty evidences that we can have, but it's perfectly plausible that this was being developed in other areas of Europe as well, and we just don't have any historical evidence of that, that we don't know. But what is interesting in here is the coat of plates that here maybe you don't see quite well, but if you see under the mantle, between the shield and the mantle here, you see that there is a triangular um, uncovered part of the armor that is showing essentially certain quadrangular plates that are riveted to the inside of the surcoat, plausibly, and that make up the wall, the wall plate. And it's interesting that even in very similar fashion you find the laminated scale coverted skirt here, that, however, as Nicole suggests, might have been kind of a classicism, maybe something that the Italians at this point were copying from Byzantine art, reminiscent of some certain classical fashion and taste, but it's still extremely interesting as a whole thing. Then you find a pretty standard gear. Here we have a triangular shield that is used, interestingly, in front of the body, and however, this form of shield was perfectly average that time. Shields during the 13th century had tended to be resized exactly because armor was being strengthened. So basically, having a large shield, if you had a wood, if you had a plate, a metal plate armor on your torso, maybe was kind of useless, because the heavier the shield is, the more cumbersome it is. So maybe shrinking it. And in fact, if you look at late medieval shields, especially when full plate armor was developed, either they were very small or sometimes they weren't even used at a point. And this is the time in which shields from an all enveloping shape for covering the whole body kind of shrink to these small triangles, but this is kind of still large enough. Then the spear, this is Saint George killing the dragon, and the helm, as we were saying, this is sensed as a typical home of the time, as it's said in French. It's very interesting that the also the names of weaponry as this time is dominated by the areas that kind of produce the part of the panoply. And you noticed, I don't think this is perspective, you notice on the top of the helm that there is a kind of a hump, and this is was evolving towards the great helm forms with the the curved kind of top of the helm. And the horse is not armored, because horses were very rarely armored at this point, because it was already expensive. It was already having a full armor for the knight equated to have like a personal jet or private jet or something, and the horse, being much larger than a human, would have costed like much more than that to cover all in mail, but they still existed, especially in the wealthiest nobility of the time. There was this elite that could afford in very small numbers mail for horses. But generally speaking, the same thing we were talking about before, horses needed also to be agile on their kind, so sometimes you could even go with unarmored horses, which was risky because as we were saying, with the development of crossbows, especially horses were a pretty easy target. We know that there was a very high mortality among horses at this time, differently from the knights that instead were covering themselves, so these poor animals would be killed in that fashion. But it was normal at the time for the horse, on average, not to be armored. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel. If you have any question, please feel free to point it out. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening, and I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.